This game is without a doubt the game of the day in round 8 of the candidates. So Hikaru Nakamura had white here, he was playing against Fabiano Caruana. Let's see what happened. So he kicks off with pawn e4, e5 from Fabi, and we go down the main line of the Roy Lopez. This bishop comes out, pawn a6, it drops back here, knight to f6, castles, and now Fabi's the first one to take the game in a different direction, so he takes on e4 here, going into the open Spanish. Now white goes d4, main line, and you don't have time to actually win a second pawn here as black. The problem is, as I'm highlighting here, the rook comes to the e-file, you're not yet developed, black's in trouble. So instead of taking, b5 was played, the bishop drops back, now pawn d5, and Hikaru wins his pawn back here. So bishop e6 from Fabi, it sits rock solid on that square, and there are different ways for white to now play here. a4 was played by Jordan van Forest against Shak Mamadyarov in Tata Steel earlier this year. I covered that game, really exciting one. I'll link it at the end of this video if you're interested. But here Hikaru goes c3, very main move, taking control of d4. You know, sometimes black wants to push this pawn if they can. Bishop c5 now from Fabi. You can also go to e7 there, many different options of course. Hikaru develops his knight, and now Fabi just castles. This one's not actually a threat at the moment, because after pawn recaptures, you're kicking this knight away, and then this pawn on e5 is actually weak, so it's not good for white. So we didn't have captures, the bishop nudged back to c2, and now here Fabi actually takes on f2, gives up the two minors. I mean, if you take on d2 here, the problem after the queen recaptures is that white just has a very comfortable game. You can see these bishops are already pointing at the king, the queen could join the attack. This pawn actually takes a lot of space, helps the attacking ideas, so it's not ideal. Fabi plays the main move here. When you run this with the engines, it gives it as a level position, but actually for me, it is easier for white to play here because you give up the two minors for the rook and the pawn. Usually that's not such a good idea, but black's whole idea now is to gain an initiative and also take over the center. So pawn f6 is the key follow-up move. You're ripping open the f-file for the rook, you're pressuring the center, and the main way to play here is actually takes on f6, and maybe this was Fabi's main prep, because Hikaru didn't play this, and now he just manages to neutralize Caruana's initiative quite effectively. So instead of taking on f6, Hikaru goes knight to f1 here, he gives black a pawn and the center, and lets Fabi open the f-file. What's his big idea? Well, he's gaining some time here to bring pieces around his king. So he now goes king to g1, and you can't get too premature with these pawn pushes here. You know, if you go e4 straight away, for example, well then the knight can hop into g5, you're pressuring this bishop. This pawn could be under fire soon if you're not careful and you lose that bishop on e6. So instead, Fabi just goes queen d6 here. He connects the rooks, starts bringing pieces into the game. Bishop e3 now from Naka. The bishop now came to f5, and you can actually exchange these ones, not a bad move, then sink a knight on g3, but Hikaru actually brings the bishop back round here, pressures this pawn, and now the rook came across, defending that one, and queen e1 from Hikaru. He's actually travelling into here, where he'll then be pressuring on these dark squares. So knight a5 was played, hits the bishop, frees up the c-pawn. Now queen f2, looking at c5, and so the knight drops back, covers that square, and rook e1 from Hikaru, great move, pressuring this pawn here, and Fabi actually makes a bad move in this position already. So he should slide the rook across, defend this pawn, but instead he actually plays c5 immediately, and this gives Hikaru this opportunity to go bishop g5, hit the rook, and now if it slides across to defend, you can actually win a pawn here through tactical ways. So after the rook recaptures, then you slide back, that's a pin, and if you defend it with the other rook, well now you can take here, rook recaptures, and queen g3 is just an absolute killer. So this would have been a lot better for Hikaru. Not that this would have been necessarily exactly how the game went, but he could have won that pawn on e5 there. but he missed this whole bishop g5 idea. Instead, knight g3 was played, but now after bishop to d3, Fabi can start getting the setup that he's looking for, because queen d2 was played by Hikaru, pressuring that bishop, but the pawn kicks on to c4, this one drops back, and now we can see that Fabi's just got this monster thorn in Hikaru's position. So the rook now came to d7, preparing to double on the f-file. Bishop f2 played, pressures this pawn. This rook now came to the f-file, and now if you actually take this pawn with either of the pieces, well then we're taking this bishop on f2. Good game for black. So that's why this weird looking move, knight h1 was played, covers that bishop, prepares to meet pawn to e4. e4 was played anyway, and now this knight hops into d4, it lands on that wonderful square, but in compensation we can see that this e-file has now been firmly closed and the bishop is cemented on this d3 square. So queen g6 played, and now a really nice move from Hikaru. He has to start unravelling somehow. He goes pawn to h4, and it might look weakening, but because of these bishops here supporting the squares, this actually now gains some nice space. And if you try and shut that advance down, well then queen g5 can come. The best is to actually swap here, pawn recaptures, this is attacked. If you defend it, well then we can go knight c6, we're really hopping around. Good game for white. So we didn't have pawn h5 from Fabi, he brought this knight back into the game. Hikaru kicks on with h5, queen d6, and now the bishop comes to g4, wonderful square, looking at e6 in combination with the knight. Pawn h6 played from Fabi, and now queen e3. This actually sets up a battery, looking at the knight on c5. There are different tactics in the air, and that's why Fabi actually goes queen f4 now, looking to swap off that active battery of queen and bishop. So Hikaru now takes, the rook recaptures, and now he goes knight e6, a very forcing sequence to get this piece off the board because the rooks were forked. This one recaptures with check, king h7, Hikaru picks up a pawn, but in compensation, Fabi's now winning this h-pawn, he hits the bishop, it moves to c6, and now he picks up on h5. The bishop now came to d4, look at that wonderful diagonal. This rook came back to the f-file, knight f2 comes back into the game, rook f7 played, and now this is an instructive moment. You can actually win this pawn on e4, captures like this, but then there's rook f1 check. These ones could come off, rook recaptures, king h2, and say you take here, bishop recaptures, you block this check. Well, the whole point is that it's not clear on whether or not this endgame is winning, because the rook comes behind the pawns. Yes, you can save them, but then you attack this one, white can attack here, so on and so forth. I know this is a long line, but this is the reason that Hikaru didn't take on e4. It's not necessarily clear on whether or not that endgame is winning of two bishops against rook. So instead he just waits in the position, doesn't capture that pawn, plays b4 to sort out those queenside weaknesses that could be a problem later on. Now we had h5 from Fabi. He wants to get some counterplay going down here. Pawn a4 played. We had captures on a4, the bishop recaptured, pawn h4 from Fabi, and now bishop e3 kicks that rook. This is one of the challenges for black here as well, is that Hikaru can just constantly make these small improving moves. Really not easy now for Fabi to actually make progress in the position. So the rook dropped back to f5, rook a1 now played, good move, eyes the a6 pawn. And now pawn h3 played from Fabi, excellent move, he's getting squeezed. Now what's the big idea? Well, if you take with the knight, then again there's this rook f1 stuff. You can capture like this, rook takes, king h2, and then rook e1, hits this bishop, supports the pawn. This is real counterplay for black. So that's why the knight didn't take there. And if you take with the pawn, well then again rook f3 is good for black. You hit the bishop, you threaten to check. Once again, you're just giving black a lot of counterplay. So Naka correctly doesn't take that pawn. He just went rook a2, defending his second rank. We had a captures here, and now this is really a classy move from Naka. Once again, if you take that pawn, then rook f3 is a problem. Hitting this bishop, getting tons of counterplay. Rook d1 is actually best, knight d1 rather. So instead of taking the pawn, we had bishop d1 here, covers that f3 square, and then you can pick up the pawn later on. So the rook now came to f6, defending this pawn. Naka goes bishop g4, he kicks that rook, and only then does he capture this pawn on g2. So rook g6 from Fabi, the king came up to g3, and now bishop f1, so difficult for Fabi to make genuine improving moves here. We had bishop d4, bishop back to d3, and now king f4, this one's marching in. There's a threat to go here with the bishop, so we had king to g8, coming away from the pin, bishop f5 anyway, the rook came to h6, and now knight g4 attacks that rook, and you can't start trying to invade here, or then we actually check on e6, we pick up your rook. So that's why the rook came here, it stays on that 6th rank, also covers the pawn, and now knight to e3 from Naka, a wonderful blockading square, also hits this rook. So it came over to b5 here, bishop c5 hit the rook, so much fun for white in this position here. The rook came to f6, and now king e5, that march into the position continues, king f7 from Fabi, and now here Naka should have just showed a slight bit of patience. So rook f2 was actually best here, because you hold the bishop on f5, and you prepare the move knight d5. Instead, Naka went knight d5 immediately, but now Fabi can take here with check, the king recaptures, and pawn e3, discovered check from the bishop, the king came back to e5, and then pawn e2. Now this is still winning for white here. White's actually a piece up when we look at it for 2 pawns, but there's real counterplay now, and after bishop f2 covering the queening square, now rook b8 preparing to come here, Naka actually missteps and plays an inaccurate move here. So his best is to actually go king d4 or take on a6 here. If I just show you this line, for example, yes, you can check. Now king d4, you actually let black queen and give up a piece, but the problem is that this b pawn is actually just winning the game now. I mean, say for example you check like this, the king moves away, then get the pawn going. Now if you come behind, the problem is knight b4, you block the file. If you try and jump back here and get in front, well then again we kick on to b6, and with the support of the knight, rook, king coming in, this is just completely hopeless for black. So this was actually the way to go, but Hikaru doesn't step to d4 in this position or take on a6. He goes bishop e1 here, we had rook e8 check, and then he steps this way, now giving Fabi tons of counterplay because he goes pawn g5 check, and you can't take this one, or rook e5 picks up this piece. Not good. So the king came back here, now rook e6 holds this pawn, we had king to f2, rook h6, looking to actually come down here, create lots of problems, and king e3 now came back, anticipated that, also looked at this pawn, and so Fabi checked from here, kicks the king away once again, rook h6, are we heading for a repetition? Well no, Naka goes knight e3, he's not giving up this position yet, so rook f6 check played, king g3, now rook to f1, threatening to pick up the bishop, but knight g2 hops back, saves that one just in time, and here Fabi should actually stay on the back rank if he possibly can, but he drops back to f6, and now Naka can just start to unravel his pieces. So he goes bishop to f2 here, the king came to g6, rook a5 now played, and this is an excellent rook lift. Naka's now looking to come into e5 behind that pawn, so rook e6 covers, the knight came back to e1, again the pawn's blockaded and the knight's headed here, so bishop f5 played. If you try bishop e4 by the way, well then we can go bishop e3, we're pressuring this g5 pawn, so bishop f5, now the knight came to f3, and Naka's really just unravelling all of his pieces now, so rook d6 from Fabi, but knight d4 shuts the door on that file, the bishop came back to d3, and now rook e5 comes behind this pawn. We had king f6 and knight f3 from Hikaru actually ended the game. Fabiano resigned with less than a minute on his clock. Why did he resign? Well, in this position you can't actually save this g5 pawn anymore, plus this one's completely blockaded. The computer wants this as the best move, but then you could simply capture, win this pawn here, and this is just a technically won endgame with the extra minor piece. So a great game by Hikaru, really shakes up the tournament now. He's now in third place, catching up the leaders. Jan's still out ahead, but who knows what could happen if he were to lose a game. I hope you enjoyed this one. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you soon.